Hello, everyone, and welcome to Nation Watch for today, Sunday, 16 February 2025. I'm Mervyn Williams, your host. Thank you for joining us from wherever you're joining us. I trust that you will stay with us for the duration of the program as you usually do. Today, the Burnham Foundation organized a church service in commemoration of the 102nd birth anniversary of the party's founder leader, Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham. Mr. Burnham was born on the 20th of February 1923 and died on the 6th of August 1985. Mr. Burnham served as, and this is from memory, as Minister of Education in, I believe, the first government of self-governed British Guyana. He was, prior to that, I believe, mayor of Georgetown for a few terms. Mr. Burnham eventually became Premier of British Guyana and later on Prime Minister of independent Guyana, having led our nation to independence. His work continued, and in 1970, he led Guyana in the separation from the crown to become a republic. And later on in 1980, via new constitution, Mr. Burnham became Guyana's first executive president. He was considered one of the founding fathers of the Caribbean Free Trade Area, later the Caribbean Community. Mr. Burnham embraced the non-aligned movement when it was most important in the history of our country. He supported the African liberation struggles. Mr. Burnham was voted for his work as a political leader, as an internationally respected leader, as the Caribbean man of the century. Mr. Burnham is regarded by many as the father of this nation. Mr. Burnham was not liked by all, but respected by all. And so his 102nd birth anniversary comes up in a few days, and his party, the party that he founded, the party that he led from the 13th of February 1955, has matured into a 70-year-old political party and held by many, including myself, as the strongest mass-based political party in this country. I want to, before I bring my guest in, I want to address a few issues. You see, when we in the political opposition speak about issues and address our constituents on matters, we often find ourselves being condemned by the People's Progressive Party, and sometimes even by some of our own. Rather unfortunate, but true. But when Bharat Jagdeo and the People's Progressive Party steps out there and misinform this nation, when Jagdeo reaches back into history conveniently and speaks about the PNC having banned foods and people being criminalized for eating certain foods. Particularly, I recall a certain minister of government referring to something named sardine in the parliament. I believe he meant sardines. Very, very few people come out and make statements, factual statements about these matters. Very few people come out and tell the nation that Guyana, like every other country in the world, was reeling from outrageous oil prices, a tremendous negatively impacting oil crisis, which started in the 1970s, resulting in all sorts of economic hardships for every country in the world, even the United States of America. And people do not remind Jagdeo that Dr. Jagan was a part of the policy-making, decision-making operation apparatus that resulted in Guyana going in the direction of restricting the import of certain foods. Jagdeo seems to forget, and not many have the guts to remind him, that it was Jagan's critical support to Forbes Burnham that allowed us to go down a path that lifted us as a nation from the crash. When Guyana imported cod saltfish from the United Kingdom, we started to produce Bangameri and Basha saltfish in this country. When tomatoes and boro was imported from other territories in the Caribbean, Guyana started to plant its own food. People discovered that dal could be made from tanya, that cassava can make flour, that rice can make flour, that it was gluten-free flour and it was good for your system, to the extent that right now there's a businessman in this country who's exporting rice flour very quietly and in large quantities. But they're ashamed to admit that Burnham's policies unto this day are being utilized for the enrichment of a few. No one is speaking to Jagdeo about these issues, and Jagdeo is avoiding these issues like the plague, seeking only to hold on to this nonsense about food being banned. When Jagdeo and Ali are silent about allegations of corruption, we remember Sugate. Do you remember Sugate? Do you remember who was the man who handled all the arrangements? We're going to remind you using Jagdeo's own words in this interview.
Nothing. He's a tenant in my place.
Take this from the top.
And he's a good friend of yours?
Who the person is, I can't comment on anonymous people.
Okay, well, let's talk about specific individuals. What is your relationship with Mr. Su Jurong?
So my relationship?
That's good enough.
Nothing.
As a reminder to us about allegations of corruption. Allegations of corruption at the highest level. We don't remind Jagdeo about this often enough. But he and Ali can come and criticize and condemn opposition figures for speaking to their constituency, for speaking to their constituents. And when a minister of government, a sitting minister of government, was accused of a criminal action, criminal behavior involving a minor female, we didn't hear Jagdeo condemning the minister. We didn't hear Ali condemning this minister. Instead, we heard this minister saying that he asked the president to allow him to proceed on leave. But they have the gumption to attack opposition leaders, to attack opposition political activists when they speak to their constituents about matters. When they awarded a contract to a controversial talk show host in this country for large sums of money, $160 million and all sorts of fancy money. And no work is done after years of the award of the contract, as is reported by the Stabroek News. They didn't condemn the man and insist that he completes the project. Instead, Jagdeo says he doesn't go to cabinet, so he was unaware that the man was awarded the contract. Whether you were unaware or not at the time, you're aware now. What have you done about it? Criticize that. Talk about that. And when the Bamia school was given to people without experience in building a foul pen, and that contract is now more than 2 years behind schedule, cannot be delivered. Cannot be delivered. Although the umpteenth deadline was given in January of 2025, it still has not been handed over as far as we know. Criticize that, Jagdeo. Criticize that, Ali. And leave the opposition leaders of this country alone to speak to their constituents. It was Jagdeo who talked about who going out there and beating drums and doing all sorts of things. It was Jagdeo who said, when Granger and Harmon and company come to your village, chase them out. Walk behind them and chase them out. Where was the ERC? Where were the righteous among us in our own political party? Where were they to condemn these people? But they condemn leaders within the opposition ranks. And some of us in our own political opposition now have halos over our heads and join in condemning our own. When there were all sorts of allegations of corruption in the Guyana police force, when a statement or a document purporting to be a statement surfaced, admitting that the highest ranking official in the Guyana police force collected a sum of $8.5 million to pay the bill at an international hotel for hosting the wedding of another senior police officer. Condemn that, Jagdeo. Condemn that, Ali. But no, you promote the gentleman, confirmed him in his position as police commissioner, although many contend that he's neither certified nor qualified to hold the position. The leader of the opposition has so asserted. And when he has long passed the compulsory age of retirement, unprecedented in this country, for an acting appointee to be confirmed after having passed the age of compulsory retirement. But you don't condemn that, Ali. You don't condemn that, Jagdeo. You condemn leaders within the opposition for speaking to their constituents. You have no moral authority to do so. When the government of Irfan Ali starves this nation of information regarding the Guyana-Venezuela border controversy, failing or refusing or omitting, as the case might be, to report to this nation about a matter that touches the life of every citizen of this country, talk about that, Jagdeo. Condemn and criticize Mohammed Irfan Ali for abdicating his duties to the people of this country by keeping us informed of what's happening with our territory, 2/3 of our territory. Recently, we had to find out through social media that the president of this country was in the United States. Report to us, Mr. Ali. Tell us that you're leaving. Tell us, the people of this country, what your mission is, Mr. Ali. Come back to this country and report to us. We mustn't hear on a CBS News report that our country is being considered as a dumping ground for deportees from the United States of America, from third countries. Having heard it and having asked you through the media, Mr. Ali, come clean and tell us, did you agree? Was this really raised with you, and did you agree? Have you consulted with the representatives of the people of this country? Are you prepared to table a motion in the National Assembly of the Parliament of this country to discuss that issue, Mr. Ali, so that the people's representative through whom they exercise sovereignty can pronounce on this matter on their behalf? Tell us, Mr. Ali, tell us, Mr. Jagdeo, who performs the functions of the office of president when Mr. Ali is not in this country? Tell us that. Do not jump out there and play righteous and holy by condemning opposition leaders of this country. We pay you, although we're not really sure whether you legitimately access the offices that you have. We pay you as citizens of this country. We pay you. Report to us or come to us. Mr. Ali, are you really planning to travel to the United Kingdom? What is the mission if this is true? Could you tell us? Could you tell us when you're going to leave, if it's going to be a clandestine mission or is it going to be a publicly pronounced upon mission? Who is going to be performing the functions of president when you're out, Mr. Ali? Tell us that. Report to us. And stop criticizing leaders of the opposition for doing their job. You do yours, or come to us. This country does not require hypocritical behavior in high office. This country requires accountability to the people. The leaders of this country must report to the citizens of this country. There must be a national conversation on the issue of engagement between the head of state of this country and the government of the United States of America as it relates to deportation. There must be a national conversation. Do not hide behind, I'm not prepared to disclose that at the moment. Come out and let's have a discourse on it. Get your priorities right and stop minding the opposition business. And to my colleagues in the opposition, I say to you, let us understand our mission. Let us respect those who voted for us and work for them as diligently as we will work for ourselves and in our own personal interests. Let us work for the people who support us, who want to support us, who will support us, and who will put us in the seat of government come election 2025. We must put the People's Progressive Party on notice that we are prepared to stand with our own and stand against the People's Progressive Party and their growing dictatorship. I've ranted enough. Permit me now, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce my guest, Dr. the Honorable David Hinds, co-leader of the Working People's Alliance and activist for the rights of the people of this country. Dr. Hinds, welcome to Nation Watch and thank you for joining me.
And good morning, good afternoon, and thank you for having me. I thoroughly was engrossed in your introduction, which was quite wide-ranging. And I too would like to congratulate the People's National Congress on its 70th anniversary. 7 decades is a long time. And the PNC was part of mass-based parties that emerged during the period of decolonization. And that those parties continue to this day is a testimony to our resilience as a Guyanese and Caribbean people. I also would like to congratulate the PNC as they mark the 102nd birth anniversary of Forbes Burnham. Like all political leaders, Burnham had his detractors, but I think none can deny that Burnham was a giant in an era of giants. Burnham, Jagan from Guyana are the names that are best known, but there were others in Guyana who played pivotal role. Ashton Chase, A.U.C. Guyana, Jane Phillips Gay, just to name three of them. And then further afield, Dr. Eric Williams of Trinidad and Tobago, Errol Barrow of Barbados, the Manleys of Jamaica, the Birds, the Verboord Senior, Eric Gary, they all played pivotal roles as we transitioned from colonialism to independence. And then they not only shaped our Guyana and our Caribbean, but they also intervened at the international level. Burnham and Manley, for example, were part of the struggle for a new world economic order, a new world political order. You mentioned Burnham's role in the liberation struggle in Africa, the non-aligned movement, the Group of 77. And so here were men, mostly men, but there were women involved too.
Dr. Hinds, let me just interrupt you for a moment. We had a brief interference with our power supply while you were speaking, and so we lost you for a moment. We last heard you when you were at Jane Phillips Gay in the list of persons that you were identifying as having contributed to the politics of this country.
Yes, and beyond Guyana, Burnham was part of that group of leaders. Dr. Eric Williams, Errol Barrow, the Manleys of Jamaica, Verboord, Antigua, Eric Matthew Gary of Grenada. These were all men, mostly men, but there were women who were part of their group, who brought us from...
Eugenia Charles was among those regional leaders.
Yes, who brought us from colonialism to independence. And they not only shaped the local and regional history, but they helped to shape world history at the time. Burnham and Michael Manley, for example, were in the forefront of the struggle for a new world economic order, which sought to democratize and bring equitability among nations, trying to close the gap between the big nations and the smaller nations. The New World Information Order was also something that Burnham and Guyana were part of. You mentioned Burnham's role in the liberation struggle in Africa. Really unparalleled. A small country, but there was in the national budget each year, there was money set aside for the liberation struggle. Many of the freedom fighters traveled on Guyanese passport. So Guyana's role under Burnham in international relations, I think, will stand the test of time and will go down in history as one of the great contributions of a small nation to the shaping of international relations. His role in the non-aligned movement, in the Group of 77, are all, and we can go on and on. Time doesn't permit us.
Let us not forget the fight against apartheid.
Yes. Yes. And so as you celebrate Burnham's 102nd birth anniversary, we remember that he was just 30 years old when he became Minister of Education, a young man, and the others were young. Guyana was 28, Martin Carter was 25. Jagan was old by their standard because he was 35, you know. But these were young men and women who were changing the world and preparing a place for us to be in today, you know. And whatever you think about Burnham and all those leaders that I talked about there, they have their detractors. But at a time like this, we dwell not on people's negatives, but we celebrate them to celebrate ourselves.
And we must recognize in so doing that Burnham came from the lineage of Africans who were brought here against their will and spearheaded a shift from the plantation type, bondage type life into a free society where Africans and indentured laborers and their descendants to this country were, for the first time, placed in a position where they can create their own management and governance structures, and they can people them, and they can work in the best interest of all of their fellow citizens of this country. I'm not sure that such a task could ever have been an easy one, moving from colonialism and servitude into independence, republican status, and the creation of one's own or a country's own system of governance, really with no experience to go by, no legacy left to pattern after, but it was a process of pioneering governance in its true sense and in its true form.
I couldn't agree with you more. As I usually put it, they were transforming plantations into nations. Tremendous task.
Can't be put better than that, Dr. Hinds.
Yes, you were taking, Guyana was a plantation, all we produced was sugar. That's all we produced. We produced nothing for ourselves. Everything we produced was for someone else. And you were taking these plantations and turning them into nations. Now, we always had the example of the village movement, and Burnham was a very keen student of history. The village movement, which launched the first transfer or translation of plantations into villages, and it was the sum total of those villages that were the sum total of those villages that became the bedrock for what Burnham and others did. As I said, unparalleled in human history. Unparalleled in human history. The United States and other countries took over 100 years to really find their feet. And we were forced to do it in a decade, you know. And thanks to the people, but the leaders which the people threw up. And Burnham, certainly, as I said, he was a giant in an era of giants.
Who found room for every religious denomination, ethnic group, and found a place of prominence for everyone. Our first president was of Chinese ancestry. There were indigenous peoples involved in cabinets, in parliament, and all were included.
Yes, and I like to tell my Indian Guyanese brothers and sisters, those holidays that you celebrate now, none of them came on the Jagan. All of them came on the Burnham. I mean, and sometimes I think the PNC doesn't play up that as much, But all of those holidays came under Burnham, not Jagan. In fact, we in the African Guyanese community may say to Mr. Burnham, you in that regard, you did more for Indian Guyanese than your own African Guyanese, because we did not get emancipation as a holiday until under Desmond Hoyt. you know,
Yeah.
but Burnham was keenly aware of ethnicity and race. And I suppose he rather said, I rather get the curse from my own than for me to go down in history as not respecting the heritage of other ethnic groups. I mean, Temeri Airport was named after our Amerindian brothers and sisters, Mashramani.
And then desecrated.
And then desecrated change. The PPP who claim to love our first peoples took away their name from the national airport and give it to their leader. You know, that's a little.
It was bigger. It was bigger and more painful than just taking away the name. That place was named after a ceremony, a spiritual ceremony,
Yes.
calling on the ancestors of the indigenous people, and bringing to light the belief of our peoples, and then desecrating that place. It was a complete insult to the indigenous peoples of this country. But Dr. Hinds, we're here to discuss this whole question of poverty in this oil-rich country of ours, Guyana. And it is something that many people are not able to wrap their heads around. How is it that we are on paper such a rich country, but yet the cost of living is backbreaking? The difficult circumstances that we face in our country as citizens, the hardships that we must endure, the difficult circumstances with which we're faced. I want to focus as a starting point on the African Guyanese population as it relates to poverty. And yes, we can take the criticisms from the detractors out there whose heads are buried in the sand. That's okay. We have our business to take care of. Dr. Hinds, in this country, there is a measure of ethnic discrimination, and there is also political discrimination. And there are, in my view, three sections of society that are hardest hit. And I want to look at the African Guyanese community, and I want to present some photographic evidence of the conditions under which some communities, some African Guyanese communities live and operate. This is what we're going to look at here. If you join me as we look at this, these are communities occupied predominantly by African Guyanese. And what we're looking at here are the conditions under which these people are forced to live because of their circumstances, while in fact the government of Guyana says that they care about all Guyanese and that they're creating housing for all. And when we look at what in fact the conditions are that African Guyanese in the city live under, we do a comparison with what obtains in other communities, it is rather instructive. And I wouldn't be surprised if the ERC writes me on this. I am prepared to stand before them and to testify on the basis of evidence that this that we are seeing here represents the conditions under which some African Guyanese citizens live, particularly in the city of Georgetown. And the housing that they People's Progressive Party is talking about creating leaves a lot to be desired, not only in terms of to whom such units are allocated, but the type of accommodation that they're looking at. And we also have some images in that regard, and we have some comparative images of other communities. Here is where the affluent Guyanese live, own homes, and we know where the money in this country circulates, and this is a prime example of the high end of housing in this country. These are actually private housing schemes. And then we have, I believe, an image somewhere in the bank there of the houses that are being constructed supposedly for citizens of Guyana. And you know, it's very interesting that even though it is being suggested that these units are being built for Guyanese, we know that the people who live in the circumstances that we first showed are never under the PPP going to get these houses. We'll show the image of that house in a minute. I think it's built of some kind of corrugated sheet or something of that nature, more like an oven, more like a furnace than a home. Dr. Hinds, what are the consequences? These are the structures that are being built for citizens of the country. Just put it up there and let it stay there for a bit and soak in. Dr. Hinds, what are the consequences of continued marginalization of a large group of citizens and the continued existence in circumstances of poverty as depicted by those pictures? What are the consequences for the nation as a whole? I mean, there might be some short-term objective of the People's Progressive Party that we might be familiar with, but in the longer term, if this is allowed to continue, what are the consequences for us as a country?
Yeah, I think that's a very instructive question. And let me preface it by saying these structures that you have on the screen there are nothing more than glorified lodges, you know, upgraded lodges. And those young people in our audience who may not remember what lodges look like, the housing for our Indian Guyanese brothers and sisters on the sugar plantations. And when you see these structures, you ask yourself whether our leaders have a sense of history, whether they have a human touch. Because, you know, you build these kinds of little boxes for people. What are you saying to them? You're saying to them, you may have come out of indentureship. You may have come out of slavery. You may have come out of the, some of you may have come out of the bush, as we like to say. But your circumstances do not permit us to, in a symbolic way, show that you've moved from the lodges, the barrack yard, the nigger yard, the bush into modernity. These little things there are a reminder that our government has resisted bringing our people into modernity. No modern government with the kind of money that our country has will build these things. Bob Marley referred to them as concrete jungle, because that's what you're creating here. And when you put people to live in jungles, they develop the jungle mentality. And you, instead of moving the country forward, you are really moving the country backward, because you are not investing in human capital. You're not investing in human beings. So you may have big skyscrapers in other parts of the country, but your people remain in this state of plantationhood. And you cannot develop a country like that. Ultimately, over time, because these people are human beings, they will rebel against their conditions. You see, in the 1930s, from the Bahamas in the north to Guyana in the south, the workers rose up against British colonialism in what is now known derogatively as the 1930s riots. And these workers, led by their trade unions, were protesting against bad working conditions, bad living conditions, poor wages. And after the riots, the British sent a commission, the Moyne Commission, to find out why these people were rising up. And the commission did its investigation and told the British they want their freedom. That's why they're rising up. They want to be free. Now, the British, imagine you enslave and colonize people for 3 centuries, and they're rising up, and you're asking why they're rising up.
Why? Exactly.
You see, they're rising up because they're human beings. And ultimately, this is not going to be sustainable in Guyana. People are going to find ways, either with their leadership, their political leadership, their trade union leadership, or without. They are going to find ways to rise up. And we're going to be in a permanent state of instability. The way you get out of a permanent state of instability is to invest in people, invest in raising their living standards. Now, we brought a lot of things out of colonialism, but perhaps the most hurting and the most fundamentally backward thing that we brought out of colonialism is poverty. And poverty has remained there around the necks, the collective neck of our people. And this government has the opportunity to tackle poverty as an issue that is embedded in the psyche, in the infrastructure of our country, and that via policy, if you go after poverty, you are going to unlock so many other things. If we solve poverty, we solve education, we solve healthcare, we solve employment. Because as people get out of poverty, they become more skilled, their labor would be worth more, their wages will go up, and so on. So any sensible government, any humane government will tackle poverty as an urgent necessity, because it is what is holding back our country. It is what will keep our country in this state of imbalance, in this state of anxiety, in this state of human imprisonment. And you don't want that for development. Now, you mentioned poverty as it manifests itself in the 3 ethnic groups. All ethnic groups, as you're right, all 3 ethnic groups live in poverty for the most part. Most of their people live in poverty. It is just that the poverty manifests itself differently in each community because each has its own history. Our Amerindian brothers and sisters, confined to the hinterland, which really is a nice word for the backlands. They're out of sight. They are the people.
We're going to be dealing with that as a substantive issue.
Yes.
But the thing here is that, again, I have issues with us as opposition parties, particularly my party, the People's National Congress Reform. I have issues with us not going out there and taking the information that exposes the People's Progressive Party for what and who they really are. This on the screen is what they are offering to our citizens as housing, for which they must pay. They must go to the bank, they must get mortgages, and they must pay. And according to Ali, this increases their worth, and they have no financial leverage that they can use to go and build businesses. Most of the people who live under the conditions that we've shown in those still photographs when we started are not in a position to obtain loans from the banks, because outside of the security that they have to offer, the means of repayment is questionable. The circumstances under which they live present them in such a way that the institutions are prejudiced against them. The People's National Congress under Lyndon, Forbes, Sampson, Burnham created housing schemes, and there's evidence everywhere you turn. Outside of the joint services scheme, outside of the stevedore scheme, outside of the GPSU scheme, outside of all of those housing schemes that are in East and West Ruimveldt, North and South Ruimveldt, and so on, in Linden, in Mabaruma, in West Demerara, on the East Coast, in Berbice, all across this country, there's evidence of quality houses, quality housing, even where Irfan Ali lived, even where he lives, but I don't know if he still lives there. That housing scheme was constructed under the PNC. And it's not like this nonsense you're seeing on the screen here with a couple of zinc sheets knocked up against some uprights in an uneven and horrible looking environment. The housing scheme in which Ali grew up at Leonora is defined in such a way in terms of land use, and it is designed that, you remember this concept of it takes a village to raise a child? The play field is inside of that circular assembly of houses, so that as children play out there, adults standing in their house looking through the window or being on the landing, as we call it, can see the children playing and can actively supervise them. Where's the room for health services in this? Where's the room for recreation in this? Where's the room for education in this? Zero. It doesn't exist. The PNC created housing schemes and gave people keys to their buildings, involved people in the construction of their homes. That's the difference between these two ads. So people in the comments can continue to cuss Burnham, and they can continue to talk down the PNC, but the PNC's development plan for this country has always and will always be superior to the People's Progressive Party's absence of planning. Dr. Hinds, there is another particular group in this country that lives in abject poverty. And this is a large cross-section of the East Indian population of this country. If you were to go to Region 3, for example, and you were to go to the Parika Sea Dam or to the Anna Catarina Sea Dam, or you were to go in, I'll ask viewers to forgive me using these words, but these are actually the names of these housing schemes. Shit and Shai, Skull City, Plastic City. These are places where Guyanese citizens live. Container City. And the East Indian population of this these communities are taken for granted by the People's Progressive Party. Nothing is done for them during the PPP's term in government. But in every other support area where they believe that the people are fairly independent in their thinking and can make decisions on their own, they go and put concrete strips and call them roads. I believe we may have some clips of those, I'm not sure. But in these settlements, the People's Progressive Party does not go there and root them up with excavators, you know. They do not go there and tell them, come and let's take you someplace where you'll get proper housing, you know. They leave them there. And then when an election cycle comes, they go and they give them certain messages that cause them to become fearful for their own safety by telling them things that people of another ethnic group are likely to do to them if they were to get into power, even though that group was in government and no such thing ever happened. They continue to play on that. I listened to the deliberations in one particular PPP meeting in West Demerara, where a pundit said to those gathered, don't frighten them go come and them go bully you. But Abby got one man who could stand up to all them bully in the PNC. He named Bar Jagdio. That's the message. I was there. And I can name him too, but I wouldn't. These poor citizens are taken for granted, and at the election cycle, they're going to take cash grants and give them because they treat them as though their vote is for sale. Their vote, the power of the X, is being devalued by a political party that cares only about enriching itself, its friends, its families, its favorites, and as somebody said, its flatterers. Dr. Hinds, speak to the East Indian population of this country that lives in abject poverty. The consequences for this country are real, are striking, and are painful if this is to continue. How do we extricate this and other populations living in poverty, living on less than $5 per day? 48% of us are in that situation. Speak to this particular group of citizens of this country.
The numbers there tell the story. 48%, that's half of your population. And if you were to raise that 1100, because it's 5.5 US dollars, 48% of all people are living on that and less. Let's say you were to raise that and raise it to 2,000, which would be 10 US dollars per day. It will go up to about 80% of our population living in poverty if you were to raise the poverty ceiling to, let's say, 10 US dollars per day. Yeah. Almost 80% to 90% of our population would be living in poverty. So based on those numbers, 48% of our people are living in abject poverty. And another 40% are living moderate poverty, you know. So it's really damning. Now let me go back and to see the PNC under President Burnham. I'm told to say President Burnham. The PNC under President Burnham had a vision for Guyana. They'd come out of colonialism and they did not have much resources. Government did not have much money. We are monoculture societies. We were dependent largely on sugar and bauxite and to some extent rice. Our revenues were not very much. But the vision that the PNC and Burnham had was one to radically bring our people out of abject poverty into a state of peoplehood. And they had to make choices. Are we going to spend on bridges and roads and skyscrapers? Or are we going to spend on education and housing and healthcare? And if you go back and look at their program, they spent on housing. You enumerated the housing schemes, right? So I don't have to go them over. So housing was a priority. Education was a priority. You and I are testimony to that priority.
At least 12% of the budget went there.
That's right. Healthcare was a priority. Then they did spend on infrastructure. We look at the bridges, the bridge over the Mararo River and so on and so forth. But the emphasis was on human development, housing, education, health. And so they had a vision of where they wanted to take the country. And their policy priorities flow from that vision. Let's fast forward. What is the vision of the PPP? The vision.
Division.
The vision of the PPP is to create a small group at the top that is going to dominate the rest of the society. So they're not going to spend on housing for the poor, or education for the poor, or healthcare for the poor. They're going to go in those sectors and they're going to spend on infrastructure, because infrastructure becomes now the means by which you transfer resources to that oligarchy elite at the top. That is their vision for Guyana. And so out of the vision comes the policy or lack thereof. When you build these houses, as I said before, you are sending a message about your priority. And that your priority is really not to pull people out of poverty, because people are not going to come out of poverty when you put them in these boxes. And so therefore, there is no vision on the part of the PPP. As it relates to our Indo-Guyanese sisters and brothers, that community is as impoverished as all the other communities, Amerindians, the African Guyanese. Amerindians, and we will get to them, they are probably more impoverished, not probably, definitely, than the other two groups. But we sometimes believe that Indian Guyanese do not live in poverty, partly because Indian Guyanese give the impression that I mean, I like them over there, you know? So they give the impression that they're living good. Those who are zealous about the PPP, they probably get more crumbs than Amerindians and Africans, and so they consider that to be better than the others. But the evidence shows that they live in the same conditions, impoverished conditions, as the other group. What the PPP is doing is that they are creating a population among Indian Guyanese of cynics, making people look at their reality and say, this is not the reality. They're forcing people to look at poverty and say, this is not poverty, because my house may be 2 inches larger than the African Guyanese house, and that my concrete strip may be 2 meters wider than the concrete strip over there. It means that we are not in poverty, but indeed they're in poverty. So when you socialize people to see their conditions and to deny their conditions, you're creating a population of cynics. And ultimately it will come back to bite you, because human beings by our very nature are not cynical beings. You can fool some of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time. and it ultimately will catch up with you. So you create a hostile community among African Guyanese who look at their conditions and said, these conditions have not improved. You have not kept up the infrastructure that the PNC put in place, the education infrastructure, the housing infrastructure, the health infrastructure. You have not invested in human beings. And there is a sense of hostility among African Guyanese. Among Indian Guyanese, you subdue that hostility. You tell them, this is not what you are seeing. So you end up producing two societies, two communities in the larger society. One that becomes cynical, the other one becomes hostile. Ultimately, when the two meet, it adds up to instability in the country. It adds up to a sense of not owning the country, a sense of not owning your communities. And so what people do, those who can escape from the country, escape. They migrate. Those who can't migrate, they live there, but they drift along, and no country can develop with communities of drifters.
I want to take a look at the hinterland setting. Dr. Hinds, indigenous peoples in this country, according to those reports that flow from studies done, are really the poorest of the poor in this country. With the size of the budget that we now have, and I'm reliably told that somewhere in the region of 55% of this budget is dedicated to infrastructure works. The infrastructure budget 2025 is larger than the budgets that the APNU AFC had to work with. Now, here is a look at what's happening to our hinterland residents, particularly those who access the city from Region 9 via road. The conditions are painful. One would imagine that leaving a set of impoverished conditions in a village setting and heading to what is the capital city of our country, that the journey itself would be a revelation, removing one from a particular setting and taking one to a more comfortable and enjoyable sort of environment. Money is being expended on infrastructure. Grants are being given as part of a massive rigging scheme to buy votes in indigenous communities. But the real issues that confront the indigenous peoples, the issue of poverty, the issue of high cost of living, the issue of not being able to access certain basic public service facilities, these are not being addressed. And our indigenous population continues to struggle under the yoke of suffering, while heavy sums are being spent or said to be spent on infrastructure to benefit the hinterland region, but seem only to be benefiting the contractor class and not the citizens who most need those interventions. Comment, please, Dr. Hinds, on the issue of the indigenous peoples, particularly as it relates to poverty, the high cost of living, and overall the difficult circumstances under which our people live.
You know, this is very painful, Brother Mervyn, You know, I grew up in a community where people were mixed with African and Amerindian. I refer to as Buchan people. And I, you know, as I went along in school, I finally asked my auntie, what Buchan people mean? And she explained it to me. The African is the people, and the Amerindian in you is the less than people. And I tell that very well-known story to say that, you know, if you view people as human beings, then you start your developmental policy from that narrative. If you don't view them as human beings, full human beings, then your developmental priorities and narratives will be consistent with that worldview. Now, Walter Rodney wrote the famous book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And we can look at the Native American, the Amerindian history, and say, oh, the Columbus experiment, the Columbus adventure underdeveloped our Amerindian communities. When Columbus came in 1492, these were thriving civilizations. I remember as a schoolboy reading about the Incas, and I was fascinated with the
technological advancements.
Oh my goodness! I remember that to this day I was in love with the Incas. Technology.
And don't forget the Mayas and their
the Mayas.
accomplishments.
You see, and the Aztecs, and we can go on and on and on and on. All right, the term Caribbean
comes from Carib.
Oh, Carib, brothers and sisters. And so I am saying that's
my people, if it may interest you.
Okay.
That's where I come from.
Okay. Oh, you're a Carib fighter.
Yes.
Fighter.
Yes.
Revolutionaries. Yes. So my point is that the Amerindian communities were not always like this. The Columbus misadventure moved them from development to underdevelopment. Therefore, what is the priority of a post-colonial government? What is the priority of post-colonialism? The priority of post-colonialism is to restore the dignity of these people, first. Second, to restore their level of development. It should be a priority. It should be a priority. I don't like the term hinterland because I know what it means. It's a glorified term for bush. All right? These people are central to our country. They are the gateway to Latin America. And so, therefore, they are as important as any people. Giving them a month that is called Heritage Month, but not giving them real transformational development is hypocrisy. And I am of the firm view that you have to have a separate developmental trajectory for the Amerindian communities. Their history is different from the history of African Guyanese and Indo-Guyanese, Indian Guyanese, and it must be treated as such. The point I'm making here, Brother Mervyn, is that in the Indian Guyanese community, the African Guyanese community, the Amerindian communities, we have to have combined development, but also separate development because the histories are separate. The Amerindian communities will require us to dig deeper in order to restore their economic viability. Look at what they gave us. All the foods that some of our ethnic communities claim today, the Amerindians gave it to us. And so therefore, any government in Guyana, as a priority, must be putting forward policies policies that are particular to the Amerindian communities. All three communities need affirmative action. The Amerindians need affirmative action because their history of denial is longer than the history of Africans who came here and met Amerindian people. And they came from civilizations too. They came from great civilizations in Africa. And they were underdeveloped here as slaves. And East Indians come from the great Asian civilization. And they're coming here, underdeveloped them. And so therefore, my argument is we must pursue common developmental trajectories, but side by side with those common trajectories, there must be trajectories that are particular to each community. The Amerindian community, bad health, poor education. If we think Black people and Indian people, education is poor among them, just look at the statistics. When it comes to the results at the various exams. And it is not because Amerindians are not capable of education. When an Amerindian child goes to Bishops and Queens and these big schools, they go to the University of Guyana, they perform at the same level of all ethnic groups, and in some instances, better.
Just the opportunity that is required. Dr. Hinds, I want to make two observations here. If one were to look at the indigenous African and the indigenous Guyanese, one will see some serious similarities in terms of how socialization takes place. What are the societal values within those civilizations, and how they value community, how they value communal ownership, how they value cooperation, how they value this whole business of community activities. For example, there is still in some villages that are not yet overrun by PPP's injection of money for all sorts of purposes. You can still find what in the Carib language we call kayap. And I believe the Machumong, I believe, I don't get the pronunciation correctly, but the folks from the North Rupununi, the Makushi people, call it that in their language, but it's all about cooperativism, where you come together to clean your village, where you come together to erect a structure for community purposes, where you come together to celebrate an accomplishment, where you come together to clean a farm, and then you move to the next, and then you move to the next until all the farms have been cleaned, and you can progress. It's similar to the African traditions. The second observation I want to make here is that at independence, the record showed that the indigenous people's population in this country was just over 4%. At the moment, I believe if the census figures are released, you will find the indigenous population ranging somewhere among 15 to 16% of the national population. And therefore, there is a campaign in the People's Progressive Party to finally recognize the importance of indigenous peoples, having regard to the need for securing their votes to get back into government. As a consequence, they seem to be heightening their disrespect for the value sets of indigenous peoples, causing them to believe that if they just sit back, the PPP will come and bring gifts for them, and they will be comfortable without recognizing the damage that the PPP is really doing to the psyche of the indigenous people. There must be a concerted effort to stand up against this abuse, this psychological abuse of a people in this country. What say you, Dr. Hinds?
Yes, this characterization of indigenous people as people that you can throw trinkets to, they like gift. The story is, the last person that give the indigenous people a gift will get their vote. And I hear politicians with that thing, and it sickens me. Yeah. Because I know among Africans, they say, who can give them more rum, a woman, and a small piece will get their vote. And among East Indians, who can pint money and say money, 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 because they're money makai. And so this characterization of the different ethnic groups in this derogatory way is what is driving the PPP government. And, if I may say, my recent jihad against people who I call by a certain name, I am less concerned about the people who are going over. What I'm concerned about is in exchange for going over, going into the communities and buying their votes on behalf of the PPP. That is what I am concerned about.
That's another category of poverty.
Exactly.
That's poverty that resides in the head.
That's right. And then you dumb down the vote. Because if I can sell my vote for a $10,000, if I can sell my vote for $1 million contract, then the vote is no longer sacred. The vote becomes part of the marketplace or election. As Transparency International has said, and I know you're going to come to that.
Where is exactly where I'm headed now.
They have said, the elections have become part of the marketplace where you go into the communities, these elites, these political parties, and you buy their vote. So if I know I can sell my vote, then I will no longer consider my vote to be sacred. And so when I lashed out at those people last week, it was not about them. They can go and join whatever party. I fought for the right of Guyanese to belong to any party they want. When Dr. Dragon told the WPA in the 1970s, don't come into the Indian communities, we said, no, we are going to go into the Indian communities. So we fought for the right for parties to go wherever and to recruit. What we didn't fight for the right for is for parties to go into communities and buy people's votes.
Or divide the citizens.
That's right. And that's my jihad.
I want to shift in the direction that you were going there a minute ago on the Transparency International Perception of Corruption Index. But I want to say this before. Infrastructure development is necessary for the building of a nation. But there's a difference between responsible investment and wanton waste. If one were to look at the PNC's accomplishment in the early days of independent Guyana, you will see that the Linden Highway still stands. They've broken it up with the heavy vehicles that they used to develop other places, and now they must fix it. Although the resources were there to do so before, they didn't. The MMA ADA project was developed so that food could be put on people's tables, so that farmers can benefit, so that the citizenry can be fed in this whole drive for self-sufficiency. The Guyana School of Agriculture was developed to train people in the agricultural sector. The research center, NARI, was developed to do scientific research so that crops can be studied, the most suitable, the best producing crops could be put in place. The University of Guyana was a set of buildings constructed to house students, to make the environment of education, imparting to people a more comfortable experience. Community high schools were constructed, recognizing that there was a need for tech-voc type education ever since then to balance with academics. The multilateral schools were constructed to bring diversity, to add to food sufficiency, to add to technical capabilities being developed and all that. The Demerara Harbor Bridge was constructed to connect 3 regions to make life easier for people, for the movement of goods and for services and people and so on. What we have now is a mad rush to spend money. So there's a bridge here, but we build a next one here. There's a road here, but we build a next one here. There is no plan that says, let's connect the 10 regions by road. This government doesn't have that plan. The opposition of which we are part has such a plan. This government has no plan that says, let's identify where sporting talent resides and take facilities there for the development of sporting talent. This government doesn't have a plan that says, there are farms here and there are markets there. Let's ensure that the road links are created to make life easier for the farmer and goods cheaper for the consuming public. There's none of that. There is this friend here who needs a piece of land behind there, so we'll make a road here to create an access for this friend to grow. So there's a marked difference here. But up comes Transparency International and says what it says, gives Guyana the mark that perhaps makes it look even better than it ought to in the view of some. And out comes Ali bellowing in that unstately voice that he addresses the people of this country in, and complains about Transparency International while refusing to examine where the real perception indicators are pointing. No investigation of Sugate, no investigation to determine what's happening at the Central Tender and Tender Administration Board, no investigation to determine whether the regional tender boards are functioning properly. No investigation as to why the oversights were really removed from the Natural Resource Fund. No real examination of the reason for incomplete projects and projects running on 2 years beyond deadline. None of that. But it's the opposition that is being attacked. Your take on Transparency International and this perception report that has the People's Progressive Party dancing rhythmically on hot coals.
I love that. I was about to say there is no rhythm, but you know, put it rhythm on hot coals. Is that an Amerindian? Is that an Amerindian saying?
It's inspired rhythm.
My brother, look, Transparency International has cut through all the nonsense and they've pointed to the real story. Now, the PPP argument against Transparency International is not about whether they are accurate or not accurate. It's that they have removed the lid and skin up everything. And the PPP is very concerned about that. Now, if you start off by getting into government via corruption. Because when they did the unprecedented things and opened those boxes in 2020, corruption was written, the electoral corruption. So the PPP government is a derivative of a corrupt transaction. And once you start there, you then become unaccountable because you're saying, look, I am in office, not because of you African Guyanese, you all didn't vote for me. I'm in office not because of you Amerindian Guyanese, because some of you may have voted for me, but ultimately you didn't put me in power. I'm not in power because of you Indian Guyanese. Although you voted for me, ultimately, as they said, they wanted to put a statue of Sarah Lynch and Pompeo in the middle of Georgetown. It's those people who put us in power. You all didn't put us in power. So we're not accountable to Indian Guyanese. We're not accountable to African Guyanese. We're not accountable to Amerindians, mixed Guyanese, because ultimately you all did not put me in power. It is the money that we got from the ruling class that we use to buy international patronage. Because remember the amount of money the PPP spent lobbying international forces. And they got that money from the elites. Lend us this money, and we're going to pay you back with 1,000% interest. Lend us this money to lobby the international forces. They will come here, they will pronounce on the election, and when we get into office, we're paying you back with 1,000,000% interest. And that is what is going on. The PPP is a captive of those moneyed interests, because it is those moneyed interests that put them in power, that help them to buy the election. And once that happens, then ultimately your duty is not to your people, but to those moneyed interests. So the PPP is captive of the economic oligarchy, the political types who provide the kind of pseudo-intellectual justification for what's going on there, is what is running this country. Corruption is the order of the day, and it has to be the order of the day. This is a government that has merged the criminalized elements in the society with the state. So all those big international gangsters who are coming in and are given land and all that, they are what we call the white collar criminalized section of the society. And the state, which is run by the government, becomes indistinguishable from those elements. You don't know when is the state acting or when it's the oligarchies acting. The criminalization of the state, as Professor Clive Thomas warned us more than a decade ago. Our country is in a bad place. The integrity of your election is compromised, and if you start there, you end up where you are.
I want to move to a very pressing issue here, Dr. Hinds. And it appears to me as though some people are focusing more on outcome than they are on the cause of this issue. I want to put on the screen some images. And the cause of this destruction, the cause of the displacement of these people, these sisters and brothers from Mocha, is the greed of some others, the oligarchs, I suppose, It was alleged that these people were in the path of this road that was being constructed. And so they had to be removed. There was no regard for the fact that some of them lived there for more than 30 years. There was no regard for the fact that a lot of these people, that all of these people, made their living, based their livelihoods on what they did in these lands and on these lands that they called home. And a ruthless regime removed them without consideration for anything. It was a brutal attack on human beings by an institution called the government that generally has a responsibility for the welfare, well-being, and best interests of citizens of any country. And then it was discovered that these lands really were not in the path of any road, but were of interest to some other people. And so the regime offered token settlements to these hardworking citizens of this country. Some decided that they were going to court to ask for judicial pronouncements on their rights with respect to these lands. The court has ruled. The court has ruled, as I understand it, that they did not manage to establish within the framework of the law their rights to these lands. That is not necessarily the end of the matter. There are higher courts to which they can, if they want to go. But the People's Progressive Party and its mouthpieces such as Anil Dandlal are saying that the leader of the opposition and the parliamentary opposition must take care of the interests of these people who did not get a favorable ruling from the courts of the land. The cause of this court proceeding was never the political opposition. It was the ruthlessness of the People's Progressive Party against citizens of this country. That's the cause of the displacement and of the approach to the court. It is the government's obligation, as I understand it, to reach out to the citizens who ask the court to rule on their rights. It is the responsibility, nay, obligation of the government of Guyana to address the needs of these people. There cannot be, in my humble view, Dr. Hinds, a blame game when it comes to the welfare and the well-being of citizens of this country. It cannot be a political blame game. It has to be the assumption of responsibilities in accordance with what is just, what is right, and what is fair. Talk to us, Dr. Hinds, on this particular matter of the Mocha Arcadia displaced residents, citizens of this country.
Thank you, my brother. Look, the people were on public lands, not government land, public land. Public means that collectively all Guyanese own that land. That's the first thing I want to say. There's nothing like government land. You can call it state land because the state include the people. The people are at the base of the state. There is no state without people. All right? And so therefore, whether you call it state lands or public lands, those lands are owned collectively by all of us Guyanese. That's the first thing. If the government, in its wisdom, wants to build something developmental on public land, and people are on that public land, then it is incumbent on the government to sit down with the people and to reason with them. The government has the right of what they call eminent domain. The people have the right to life and the right to a living. The people are making a living on that land. It was their livelihood. They weren't there playing cards and dominoes. They were living there for decades. It was their livelihood there. And so government has a right. The people have a right. The government's duty is to promote order. The people's duty is to affirm their freedom to a life, to a living. And so when you have the clash of order and freedom, you sit down and you work it through. The government cannot use force as a first resort, a second resort, a third resort. Force must only be used if the people use force to remain on the land. The facts of the matter is that the people did not use force. And so the government had a responsibility to work until you arrive at a compromise that is satisfactory to all. The government did not do that. So the government violated the human rights of people in pursuit of development. Let's turn to the court. I'm a respecter of the court because the court has over the course of our history, when it matters to the underside of the poor and the powerless. Without the court in the United States of America, African Americans would not be full citizens. Without the courts in our Guyana and the Caribbean, we would have been in much more mess than we are. So I respect the court. I, however, respectfully disagreed with this court ruling. I feel that the court did not look at rights. I quote Thurgood Marshall, the first African-American jurist on the Supreme Court of the United States. He said, as an African-American justice, my task is not to contract rights, but to expand rights. And if our court adopted that philosophy, it would not have concluded with the ruling that it concluded with. There is no way you can look at poor people, or you ought to look at poor people who all they have is their livelihood, their meager livelihood, and a government which has the monopoly of force comes in and destroys those people's livelihood, and the court says that those people are not due compensation. The court did not use a human rights parameter in arriving at this decision. This decision was based on a very conservative jurisprudence which has no place in a society like ours. The law cannot be over there and the reality of our lives over here. The court, which is an institution that flows from the power of the people, must always be consistent with where the people are. Ultimately, if you're going to err in a collision between state and society, any democratic court must err on the side of society, because governments come and governments go, but people remain. You cannot build a country with governments. You build a country with people. Governments are a creation of the people. The people are not a creation of government. So the people are supreme, the people are primary, and like I said, where there's a conflict between the people in the society and the government, then the people must be given the benefit of the doubt. And so therefore, I disagree with this ruling. I think the jurisprudence used was too narrow and too conservative. And what the court has perhaps now unwittingly done is to give the government of Guyana's license to go up and down the country in the name of development and destroy people's livelihood, not just their homes, because their homes represented their livelihood. And so I think all Guyanese should be enraged by this ruling. As I said, it is not about the justice who give the ruling. It is not about the institution of the court. It is about the jurisprudence that was used to arrive at this decision. I do not encourage our supporters to attack the courts or to attack individual judges. What we need to attack is a jurisprudence that is out of step with where Guyana is.
There is also another element to that. I mean, a judge will rule based on what is before that judge, and we do not know what the attorneys placed before the judge. So there is that as well.
I want to reply to that. I want to reply to that. There are certain issues that are fundamental in any society. The issue of people's right to life is fundamental. And if the lawyers may have erred in terms of what they put before the court had the duty to give the lawyers leave to go and come back. The court has that discretion. I continue to believe that on matters of the right to life, on matters of election, for example, no court should rule based on technicalities. Because on elections, it's about who governs, who gets what, when, and where. If the lawyers erred, if they made procedural error, give them leave to go and fix it. It is not unknown in the courts for them to give lawyers leave to go and fix things. And on these fundamental matters of election, of the right to life, if the lawyers came up short, the court should have given them leave to go and fix it. Because this is fundamental. This is not about two men fighting on the streets and one bungie, one eye. This is about the right to life and the right to a livelihood.
And there is the other issue of, to me, a vexed issue really, the making of this constitutional provision of land to the tiller as merely aspirational. I am not in support of that classification of that particular article of our Constitution. I believe that every step, every effort should be made to make that particular provision of our Constitution, that article of our Constitution, operational in the true sense of what I believe the framers of the original Constitution intended for that to be, until it was, I understand, reduced in status when it was reviewed in 2001, I believe it was. Dr. Hinds, your closing remarks as we wind down on this very interesting and perhaps not even long enough conversation today.
I want to thank you for having me again and to share my perspective. I think our country is at a critical juncture. At the time of independence, we were transformed. We were moving from plantation to nationhood, and we had our challenges. And we had our policies and views about the world we live in and the place called Guyana and its role in that world. And I would say the independence leaders did not do a perfect job, because none of us is perfect. They dealt with what they had, they dealt with the challenges, and they moved us to a better place than where they left, what they inherited at the time of the end of colonialism. We are now in a second independence. We are moving now from a state that has survived to a state that now can become transformed. a country that has survived the challenges of post-colonialism to a place where we can now make real the things that were aspirational. We're moving into a petro-state. And as we move into the petro-state era, the second independence, our jurisprudence has to become consistent with the times. We didn't take the colonial court and bring it into independence. We created our own justice system. It evolved over time. And as we move into this new era, our justice system has to evolve. Our form of governance has to evolve. Our characterization of what are the rights of a citizen ought to evolve. Our understanding of where people need to be in order to contribute in a tangible way to their own development ought to change. I'm arguing that what we need is a government with a vision, a government with a sense of history and where Guyana's place is in that history. And above all, we need a government that starts with the people. That every day you sit down to make a policy, you must ask, how is this going to impact the people of Guyana? And so we need a transformational government. I'm arguing that the government at the time of the transition to independence was a transformational government. We now look back and we are amazed at what they were able to do with so little. And now God has pointed very much to us. Our leaders can now take those dreams and aspirations and turn them into reality. Unfortunately, we have a government that is not anchored in history. We have a government that is not anchored in the notion of a dignified humanity. We have a government that is prepared to dismantle what we know as Guyana and to put in its place an oligarchy, a dictatorship of the worst order. And it is our responsibility as citizens to change that course, to remove that government. In removing the government, we are not removing representation for those who want the PPP to represent them. And we admit that half of the population want the PPP to represent them. But the PPP is a clear and present danger even to its own supporters. And so our removal of the PPP from office is a means to an end. The end is to have a government that is humane. And sometimes you have to remove the obstacle so that those who constitute the obstacle can recognize what they are doing. So I'm not advocating taking away East Indian representation. I'm advocating for a government that is based on dignified humanity, and the PPP is an obstacle to that. And so we have to remove them and begin to put again the building blocks. I am supporting the opposition because the opposition is qualitatively an advance on what the PPP represents. The PPP represents a one party, one small group at the top that has penetrated that party. It is no longer the party of the working class, the sugar workers, the rice farmers. It is the party, as Transparency International say, of the oligarchs. And so we have to remove them from office. As I said, I'm supporting the opposition because the opposition is talking about coalition. The opposition is talking about partnership. The opposition is talking about cooperation. And so for me, It is not a finished product, but it's a step in the right direction. I see the removal of the PPP from office as giving us the space to begin to bring our country together. Is the opposition coalition a representative of the entire country? No, no, but it has a blueprint that is qualitatively more advanced than a blueprint that reduces the vote to a market, reduces the vote to an illicit transaction that is undermining democracy, that is grounded in corruption, and that has no respect for God. And when I say God, I speak about God here in the broadest sense. And so, therefore, I urge all my Guyanese brothers and sisters of all ethnic groups to recognize that if we don't get it right now, it may take us a long time to get it right. Because if we don't get it right now, we create a condition of instability. And instability don't build up. Instability does break up. And I don't want my country to break up. I don't want my country to break up. I want my country to build on where the independence leaders took us. I want us to build on that. And so I urge you all to go out and become ambassadors. Ambassadors for a new Guyana. Ultimately, ambassadors for a free Guyana. Without freedom, there is no development. Without freedom, there is no country that you can call your own. So let us be ambassadors for freedom, and let us wage war on those who are anti-freedom.
Thank you, Dr. David Hinds. There's one issue that I wish to deal with before I wrap things up. Last night, a wicked, a malicious rumor was started. I do not know who is Guyana News Alert, but they went out there wickedly with this message that former President David Granger had died. I condemn, Nation Watch condemns, and the People's National Congress Reform condemns the actions of the person or persons behind Guyana News Alert for this wicked, this tasteless, this nasty propaganda mission that they started last evening. You do not play. You do not play with people's lives in this way. You do not spread rumors of this nature, particularly when it comes to a former head of state, a former head of government, a former commander-in-chief of the armed forces of this country. And I called on Irfan Ali to condemn equally, in the strongest way as I now do, the action of the person or persons behind Guyana News Alert and this wicked propagandistic mischief that they undertook last evening. It is this kind of behavior, Mr. Irfan Ali, that you must condemn. It is this kind of mischief, Mr. Barrett Jagdeo, that you must condemn. It is this kind of mischief, Mrs. Ethnic Relations Commission, that you must deal with. It is this kind of mischief, Mr. Commissioner of Police and Deputy Commissioner Law Enforcement must deal with. Yours is the responsibility in the security sector of this country to identify who the person or persons are behind this wicked mission and to prosecute them to the full extent of the law. You do not need a report from President David Granger. You do not need a report from anyone. You have the information at your disposal. I call on the security forces to deal with this matter, and I call on Mr. Barrett Jagdeo and Mr. Irfan Ali to condemn this action in the same way as you condemn or seek to condemn opposition leaders when they speak to their constituents. Dr. David Hinds, I'd like to thank you very much for joining me here on Nation Watch today and spending close to 2 hours as we discuss the issue of poverty in an oil-rich Guyana. And I thank our viewers and listeners for joining us and staying the course of the program with us. Until we meet again next Sunday, by God's grace, may God Almighty bless us all.